Tonight, we won't step into chronicles that list kings as if they were marble statues. Instead, we'll enter a palace that glittered with mirrors, yet was built to reflect something far more fragile than stone desire itself. Versailles was not only gold leaf and chandeliers. It was a labyrinth where attention was a currency, every glance a transaction, and every door a test of proximity to power. Here, time did not move by hours, but by ceremonies. The king's rising, the promenade, the supper, the couture, each moment, an act on a stage where the audience was also the cast. Those who longed for favor dressed themselves in patience and proximity, because in this world the shortest distance to influence was measured not in steps, but in the width of a stocking or the tilt of a curtain. So lower the lights. Let the hush of silk and the faint echo of shoes on parquet settle around you. And if your breathing begins to follow the measured rhythm of footsteps along mirrored halls, that's just Versailles teaching you how to wait. If quiet revelations like these keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next gilded chamber in the palace will be waiting for you there. Step closer now through the mirrored corridors where silence is just another ornament, and notice how the palace breathes. Versailles was never only walls and ceilings. It was a golden prison of desire, a place where even the simplest gestures, from a stocking drawn to a curtain pulled back, carried the weight of power. The palace worked like a very large clock powered by courtly attention. At dawn, just as the mist lifted over the Grand Canal, people began arranging themselves like furniture. The King's Day moved on rails, the lever, the promenade, the council, the couture. Even the moments that sounded private were crowded. A royal wake-up was not a yawn with slippers. It was a series of choreographed entries ranked by proximity to the royal body. The closer you stood to a stocking, the more your family prospered. It was a golden prison of desire because status depended on being seen, and being seen meant being present always, in rooms designed to leave few shadows. The Sun King's bedroom was technically the axis of the realm, but more practically, it was a very fancy traffic circle with excellent parquet. The building's genius was to make privacy sound like a rumor and publicity feel like intimacy. Rooms opened into rooms, and then, almost invisibly, into cabinets, closets, backstairs, and little suites called the Petty's apartments, which were less little than strategically narrow. Behind the hall of mirrors bright as a frozen sunrise ran the gallery of machines, not cogs and pistons, but the practical human equivalents, staff corridors, and service doors that moved people like currents. The palace had secret chambers with names that were not very secret at all, but everyone pretended. There were oratories that housed more whispering than prayer, and writing rooms where letters were drafted so carefully that the blotter learned court etiquette. A door within a panel could carry a person from a ceremony to a sofa in 4 steps, which is approximately the distance between public virtue and private comfort when measured in Versailles meters. The king might vanish through the paneling and reappear somewhere, scented with orange blossom oil, a reliable cousin of citrus that hides everything except itself. Furniture had codes. A screen position at a particular angle could mean, wait 10 minutes. A chair moved slightly off axis could mean, come back with the embroidery. There was even an official mistress's apartment perched like a swallow's nest above the palace's central line, a structural admission that affection, like rainwater, needed gutters. The palace made love look like protocol, and protocol look like love. A visitor might notice the endless mirrors and conclude that vanity had conquered the kingdom, but the reflectiveness served a quieter purpose. It let you see who was watching you watch the king. Watching, not touching, was the house rule. The grand apartments flowed like a river of footsteps. If you listen closely in your imagination, you can hear the soft sea sounds of silk sleeves passing one another, tide against tide. Desire was supposed to wear brocade and speak softly in the conditional mood. If a phrase began with, "It would please His Majesty if," it could end with almost anything, including the placement of a small table that would have large consequences. In a modern office building, people angle their chairs to catch the meeting runner's eye. At Versailles, people angled their entire day. The palace itself seemed to lean in, gold leaf curving toward conversations the way sunflowers bend toward light. By the time Louis XIV had perfected this shimmering routine, his shadow was busier than he was. The Sun King's official life, measured in ceremonies, produced an unofficial calendar just as precise. The visiting hours of the Maîtresse en Titre, the private devotions, the quiet walks through the Marley Cascades when the water played on cue. Mistresses were not a secret so much as a job category recognizable to accountants. Pensions, lands, apartments, and timetables accumulated like lace on cuffs. Louise de la Vallière tried shyness as a policy. It worked until it didn't. Madame de Montespan turned wit into a weapon sharpened on jeweled snuff boxes. 1,000 epigrams later, she was still grading the room with her eyebrows. Madame de Maintenon, patient and practical, discovered that piety, properly hemmed, makes an excellent velvet rope. None of this required explicit scandal to remain interesting. It was enough that bouquets always arrived from the right garden, at temperatures that suggested someone had tested the air with a wrist. Louis XIV's affections were visible in the architectural record, the way ancient rivers are visible from satellites, expansions, galleries, terraces, small theaters where a new favorite could be admired under discreet chandeliers. If you have ever rearranged your living room for a guest who stayed, you have participated in a scaled-down, sleep-friendly version of Bourbon urbanism. The court understood that one man's preferences could become a national policy. If the king liked ballet, courtiers danced until their knees made tiny weather reports. If he favored a particular scent, say, tuberose, then boxes of it appeared as if distilled out of thin air by the Perfumers Guild, who, like meteorologists, tried to predict gusts of favor. Even Sin had minutes written about it. The confessor's schedule and the mistress's carriage timetable occasionally met on the same page. The king's desire shaped costumes and harvests, diplomatic gifts, and marriage plans. A glance could send a province to work growing a flower it had never met. The wardrobes of favorites were inventories of the royal pulse. When allegiances cooled, one could chart it by the distance between names on invitation lists and the speed with which footmen appeared. It is a modern-sounding thing to say that power reprograms attention. At Versailles, the code ran in silk and shoe buckles. One footman recalled the morning. He was ordered to place a bowl of strawberries slightly to the right of a plate, a correction of 3 inches that raised a family 2 generations. Historians find such stories irresistible, not because they are dramatic, but because they are slow-moving, like a glacier carving gossip into the landscape. Louis XV inherited the big clock and all its gears, but he wound it more quietly and let the springs run in smaller rooms. His nights were not truly wild so much as repetitive, like a lullaby that increases volume in order to fade you out. The famous Parc aux Oeufs, so frequently described with sensational adjectives, functioned in practice like an administrative annex for the king's private life, which is a phrase only an ancien regime clerk could love. It was not a park, and there were no deer. It was a series of discreet apartments managed by intermediaries who specialized in avoiding paperwork. The system kept the palace floor polished and the rumors localized. Tradespeople, being the true historians of every city, knew the addresses and the delivery hours. If a basket of candied chestnuts set out at midday vanished without crossing a courtyard, it suggested that the king would not dine alone. A bolt drawn twice meant the coach could be sent away. The whole thing could have been a farce if it weren't so carefully indexed by the people who needed the money. Symbolism aside, it kept laundry busy. Amid this routine, 2 official meteors crossed the royal sky and left long, soft trails. Madame de Pompadour, educated enough to set fashion in verbs as well as dresses, discovered that desire could be converted into projects: porcelain at Sèvres, theatrical seasons, a rearranged library. When her health altered the private arrangement, she stayed, proof that companionship could be administratively upgraded. Later came Madame du Barry, whose ascent turned a jeweler's shop into a minor ministry. With her, the ritual took on a different tone, lighter, perhaps, but more precarious. Courtiers developed the art of adopting a facial expression that could be read both as approval and as the sudden remembrance of an appointment. For all the whispered condemnations, nothing here was operatic. It was domestic in its mechanics. The king was a tired man with a complicated hobby, supported by a supply chain of confectioners, dressmakers, and drivers who understood that palace policy could be read in the price of sugar. If this sounds like a very old version of a modern celebrity's entourage, it is, except the uniforms were better and the stakes were national. Over time, the king's private pattern developed the political equivalent of a limp. The routine absorbed energy that might have flowed elsewhere, which was noticeable to anyone balancing books. Ministers who needed a signature learned to time their approach between a perfumer, its delivery, and the rehearsal of a small comedy. The rhythm of the realm kept adjusting to accommodate a preference, like an orchestra lowering itself by half a tone so that a single instrument could play without strain. The more the court adjusted, the more the provinces noticed, which is the historical way of saying that letters began to mutter. When a decision about war or taxes arrived late, someone somewhere blamed upholstery. That was unfair to the upholstery, which was excellent, but the sentence slides nicely off the tongue, and people like to say things that slide nicely off the tongue. The king's difficulty was not wickedness, but drowsiness of will, that gentle slope down which statesmen's plans can roll like marbles under a sofa. On bad days, you could read the kingdom's prospects in a smear of rouge left on a wine glass, which is not a method recommended by political science, but is traditional in memoirs. By the last decades of the old regime, Versailles had become the world's most expensive screensaver. Its great fountains still obeyed the water games. The musicians still tuned. The kitchen still woke up while it was dark and yawned steam. But the palace's symbolic power, previously so blinding that people wore their social rank, like sunglasses, softened to something like nostalgia. Versailles was the symbol of excess and scandal, yes, but also of predictability, a perfectly kept calendar that refused to notice the weather. Travelers came to see the mirroring gallery and instead found themselves cataloging doorknobs. The ritual of the public royal supper continued as if etiquette were a form of governance, which it had been in a way. If you watched the king eat broth and you were fed by the sight, you lived in Versailles fully. If, however, you wanted roads filled and wheat prices tamed, you began to suspect that ladles were not policy. The elegance offended an oddly domestic register. It felt like arriving at a household that has paused the troublesome parts of life in order to polish the good spoons. The legacy of Bourbon desire is not a list of scandals so much as a pattern of distractions that grew heavy. The same palace machinery that civilized affection by giving it doors, schedules, and mirrors also taught the country to expect reform in the form of redecorated apartments. A favorite's influence could accelerate a porcelain manufactory, but not a tax system. Think of it as governing by taste, extremely effective until taste changes. Pamphleteers, whose ancestors once praised the glow of the Sun King's etiquette, discovered that a raised eyebrow travels faster than a decree. They served their paragraphs hot with insinuation, and the public found the dish familiar, since Versailles had trained everyone to read meaning in small gestures. The very skill that once made the court so harmonious, the ability to notice tiny shifts of favor, became the nation's habit. People started reading the monarchy's face the way courtiers read a smile under a wig. The result was an audience that needed fewer facts than feelings to draw conclusions. It is difficult to govern a country that has learned to take the temperature of the state by sniffing the air for tuberose. Still, even as the tide rolled outward, the palace kept its sleepy perfection. A gardener measured a boxwood edge with a string and a knot. The knot had been tied to a width preferred by a king who no longer hunted as he once did. A clock chimed the same way it had chimed when Moliere made courtiers laugh in a theater room, small enough to feel like a joke told in a pocket. A seamstress folded a dress whose color had been chosen to flatter a complexion no longer present at supper. These are details that don't change the fate of dynasties, and yet they are the texture of the past, so gentle you can rest your head on them. The Bourbon King's passions did not cause the revolution all by themselves. History is more complicated and less romantic, which makes it lovely at bedtime, but their habits did teach a generation to look at power as if it were perfume, and to judge it when the scent soured. The people who built barricades later had grandparents who built fans, and both groups understood the language of a swift, decisive flutter. If you're awake enough to notice, you might see that desire, once turned into architecture, keeps echoing long after whispers stop. The hidden stairs remain hidden. The mirrored gallery continues to show you yourself while pretending to tell you about kings. Even the smallest customs linger, like the way guides lower their voices as they describe the couture, as if the monarch might wake. The palace is both a memory of excess and a memorial to routine. It is heavy with the weight of repeated days. And there is something somnolent in that. Standing inches from a panel that once opened for someone very important, you can hear nothing at all. If you lean your head against the cool wood and close your eyes, you might feel for a second the palace doing the only thing it knows how to do, continuing its schedule. Somewhere a guard checks a latch, a fountain runs on time, a caretaker straightens a rope, and tomorrow will be arranged again with quiet exactness, the way a coverlet is smoothed before sleep. And if you drift now, the palace will go on without you, ticking softly, the mirrors watching over the room, patient, reflective, and endlessly calm. You might not expect a kingdom to run on the quiet rustle of sheets, but Versailles did, very nearly. A palace is a machine for turning time into ceremony, and linen is the oil. If you trace the day with a fingertip just lazily, as if on a soft map, you find the morning. Begins not with trumpets, but with cloth. Towels stacked like calm snowdrifts, chemises folded, so thin they whisper napkins creased into patterns that remember hands. The royal bed was a stage, yes, but it was also a schedule, and the person who knew that schedule best was not always a minister. Somewhere in the back rooms, a ledger recorded how many pillowcases went upstairs and how many came down. If you are still awake by the time I reach the live ads, and I cannot promise I will hurry, feel free to subscribe, or simply consider the idea in the manner of a cat considering a sunbeam. We will be here either way, drifting along the laundry list of a monarchy. The day's first textiles traveled in silence. Footmen carried them the way librarians carry secrets, arms level, steps measured so each fold stayed loyal. A monogram stitched at the hem, two initials bridged by a tiny crown told. The story of ownership more convincingly than law ever could. Linen at Versailles was a language. The width of a sheet signaled rank. The weave could be read like handwriting. The faint scent told you which cupboard had been opened last. There were sheets of batiste so fine they behaved like a polite breeze, and damask tablecloths that shone with woven fruit you could almost peel. The royal household counted cloth the way beekeepers count frames. A clerk did not write many napkins. He wrote 4 dozen, and 2 added a cautious question mark, and underlined the question mark twice in a very small hand. He knew that a missing napkin could bloom into a rumor, because at Versailles, even subtraction had an audience. Linen had biographies. A chemise might begin as flax from a northern field, its gray-green stalks beaten and combed until the fibers lay in neat, sleepy arrangements called strix. Spinners turn those tricks into thread with an attention that makes modern concentration apps seem flimsy. Weavers, counting under their breath, coax the thread into cloth that would be bleached in meadows, sunstroked day after day until it forgot the color of the planet once was. Then came the needle, drawing monograms and satin stitch with the same sort of patience one uses to shell peas while thinking about nothing in particular. Finally, a porter held it to the light, nodded in approval, and sent it into its court life, where it learned the choreography of beds and tables and arms. A sheet lived many lives on the royal bed during a ceremonial morning, under a sick child in a less visible apartment, stretched tight as a tablecloth during a public supper where the nation measured the king in spoonfuls of broth. When people speak of Versailles, they mention perfume, and we will. But first there was smells opposite, the ambition to smell like nothing at all. The palace trained noses the way it trained eyes. A fresh towel had to smell as if a window had been opened and countryside had rushed in politely and stopped at the sill. Laundresses, practical scientists in skirts, learned that ash-laden water known as lye would persuade grease to let go. That rinsing in cold water made a cloth think clearer thoughts. That a drop of blue indigo smalt, sometimes the mysterious powder from a tiny muslin bag, could trick the eye into believing white was whiter. If you have ever watched a friend add a squeeze of lemon to a sauce and then say, there, the feeling of that final invisible change. The palace preferred its miracles to look like ordinary work finished properly. Out behind the facade, where courtyards take off their wigs, the wash days looked like a pastoral painted by someone who loved buckets. Copper cauldrons were fed with wood until the water muttered at a domestic boil. Sheets were bucked, which meant soaked in lye so slowly that time itself seemed to be doing the work. Women stirred with paddles as tall as they were, the liquid folding and unfolding like a conversation between people who agree. A rumor says that one laundress once tried to speed the process with a polite stomp in a tub, and this may even be true. Versailles was full of experiments conducted gently. When the weather took a reasonable turn, long galleries and garden lines became drying rooms, white fields pinned to the air. Visitors sometimes mistook them for decoration because at Versailles, even chores posed as art. After wet came weight. Cloth that wished to be smooth met devices with beautiful names, mangles and calendars. A mangle was a pair of rollers, one persuading the other to behave, and cloth passed between them into a calmer version of itself. Calendaring was a pressing done with polished cylinders warmed to a particular mood until a tablecloth gleamed like an idea. Starch belonged more to collars than to sheets. It gave roughs the courage to stand up to necks. Versailles used starch-like punctuation sparingly, elegantly, and only where a sentence needed to hold its posture. The final touch, before a cloth earned its rest on a shelf, was folding. There was a preferred way to fold, handed down as carefully as a recipe, so that a footman could lift a stack and know, by the feel of the corners meeting, that everything was in order. There were, of course, inventories, because an object is never truly royal until it has been counted 3 times. The guardrobe for textiles part storehouse, part temple-kept books so measured that accountants visiting from the treasury felt soothed. Pages recorded not just numbers but destinations, 4 napkins to the queen's private supper, 1 cloth to the dauphin's tutor for dice table, 2 towels, damp, returned without comment. The phrase, without comment, did heavy lifting. Sometimes there was comment. A story survives, light as lace, about a valet who annotated the margin with stain, likely candied chestnut, which is the politest accusation in European history. Another page notes napkin, embroidered, chewed by dog, which is the only surviving instance of a Pomeranian participating in fiscal policy. This is what microhistory looks like, a nation's moods expressed in laundry notes. Perfume joined the conversation at the fold. Sachets of lavender, rose, and something called Queen's grass were tucked between stacks like punctuation you could smell. Savon de Marseille lent its clean accent to towels. A little orris root powder, faintly violet and frankly practical, kept drawers pleasant and moths discouraged. Scent, at court, was not the confetti people imagine. It was a filter applied thinly enough to make absence seem intentional. A bed prepared for a royal night might carry a suggestion of orange blossom so mild that the nose had to lean in. That leaning was the point. Everything at Versailles trained you to notice small things and to pretend you had not noticed them at all. In this sense, perfume behaved like etiquette. It hinted at harmony while disguising effort. The people who managed this fragrance of normality had titles as precise as their work. There were officers for the linens of the king's bedchamber, clerks who specialized in tablecloths the length of entire conversations, women whose hands knew the difference between cambric suited for skin and damask suited for soup. The job descriptions read like lullabies if you let your eyes unfocus. Carrier, folder, mendress, counter, perfumer, keeper of keys. The most experienced could distinguish, by fingertip alone, whether a sheet would sleep cool or warm. They were consulted like weather. When a prince lay ill and needed comfort without a thermometer's honesty, someone chose cloth with the same care that a composer chooses a key. This was medicine by textile, unscientific, and yet oddly plausible at 3 a.m. From time to time, a drama as light as a feather occurred, a hole found in a cloth meant for a state dinner, a stigma shaped like a lemon wedge on a napkin bound for the queen's lap. These were not real dramas, of course, but they let the staff enjoy the thrill of heroism in a safe, foldable size. Patches were applied in stitches so small that only daylight would clap in approval. A stain was turned into pattern with a trick of the fold, the way an experienced storyteller turns a mistake into a theme. It is possible that the only truly spontaneous acts at Versailles happened behind starched screens, where someone sighed, smiled, and fixed a problem with thread the width of patience. When people talk about royal waste, they imagine jewels, but the quantity that drew comments from visitors was actually napkins. Public suppers, served under heavy chandeliers, consumed napkins by the dozen the way waves consume the beach. There was a system, naturally. A welcome fold signaled to the diner where to place a spoon. Another fold told a footman which side to approach, left like a secret handclasp among linen. A napkin could be a map. It taught a newcomer how to behave without a word. When the meal ended, footmen whisked the cloths away in bundles that were immediately counted in a murmur that sounded to certain foreign dignitaries like prayer. In this way, devotion was paid to cleanliness, which in a palace is a close cousin to politics. We are required by the polite laws of curiosity to speak briefly of budgets. Soap bills were weather reports written in silver. In seasons of heavy entertaining, the soap rose like the Seine. In Lent it sank, only to search at Easter. Wood for boiling, ashes for lye, salary for the washers, maintenance for the mangles, a table of figures as soothing as a late-night schedule. Some treasurer surely fell asleep over those numbers with a smile, reassured that the cloth of the realm held. Once, according to a memo brittle with politeness, a delivery of inferior soap produced a rash of complaints expressed in euphemisms so delicate that the supplier had to be told plainly. In a postscript, the towels are not agreeable. Versailles spoke fluent understatement. Every object in that world survived by adapting. Linen that grew thin in respectable service moved to a gentler appointment wiping crystal, polishing mirrors, protecting a book from oily hands, before finally yielding to its last and truest vocation, becoming rag for paper. Many a memorandum that scolded a minister had been a sheet in a different life. It is pleasant to imagine that the story of a lost napkin was eventually recorded on the napkin's own grandchild. A rectangle of rag paper dignified by ink. Revolutionaries who liked clear pages and simple fonts. wrote on material that had once graced the royal bed. This is not irony so much as housekeeping. After the old regime folded itself away, much of the linen left the palace by legitimate doors, and auctions advertised with a sleepiness that belied the excitement of owning the soft history of a room. Household linens entered households. A few pieces found their way into armoires where they spent polite decades, pretending they were still on duty. Museum drawers now hold samples that curators lift like newborn cats. They note the exact weight in grams, the thread count, the pattern name, the faint smell of lavender that can survive centuries the way a rumor survives a scandal, by becoming gentler than its source. There is, in all this, a small lesson that refuses to wear a crown. Power depends on surfaces you barely notice. The tablecloth holds the argument, the towel receives the hand. The sheet remarks on the sleep and says nothing more. Versailles is famous for mirrors, but its truest mirrors were made of cloth, reflecting back to the user a version of themselves they could live with. A king could feel ceremonial by stepping into a chemise that behaved as if it had waited all night for him to exist. A servant could feel necessary by folding a napkin that told a duchess where to rest her fork. Everyone, in other words, found a role in the laundry. Sometimes I picture a laundress at the end of her day, hands tender from soap, standing by a window no portrait ever painted. She looks out at the gardens, which are pretending to be natural with great effort, and she thinks about nothing in particular, the weather turning, the prediction that starch will be dear again, whether the blue bags will hold through another season. She is one of the few at Versailles allowed to yawn in public, because her audience is a courtyard that has seen everything and chosen silence. Somewhere a clerk closes a ledger carefully so the numbers do not spill. Somewhere a footman listens to a stack of towels settling and hears a faint, friendly sigh. Modern people talk about thread count as if it mattered morally. It matters, but not in the way advertisements suggest. High numbers are simply the old promise that work was done, and done by hands that knew how to do it slowly. If you own a linen napkin on a quiet evening, you can practice a Versailles fold and understand a small piece of the palace. Place the cloth on a table, smooth it with the heel of your hand, crease it as if closing a book you intend to finish tomorrow, then leave it there. The napkin becomes a sign that order will return after sleep. We have wandered gently from lie to lavender, from monograms to mangles, from ledger lines to lines of thread. The palace still stands, though its schedules are different and its sheets are the concern of people less ceremonious and more hurried. But the old rhythm survives in any home where laundry day makes a small weather system of steam and patience. A basket carried from room to room is an unheralded parade. A towel folded just so is a treaty with chaos. If you listen, you may hear the soft applause of cloth agreeing with itself. And now, if your eyes are heavy, you can rest. Someone anonymous, capable, unthanked, has already prepared the bed, smoothed the corners, tucked the edge with a fluency no manifesto can teach. The room has the faintest memory of soap and sun. The ledger of the day is closed, the numbers add to a shape that feels inevitable, and the palace, which is to say your house, is ready to go on breathing without your help. Linen does not make history exciting. It makes history bearable. It waits, and that is its brilliance. Close your eyes. The sheets will hold you the way they held kings, without comment, perfectly ordinary and exactly right. You might not expect the palace to install little catches behind mirrors just to control the speed of gossip, but Versailles did, and it did so with the same seriousness it reserved for taxes. The palace, for all its fountains and fireworks, was above all a careful machine. It converted rooms into rules, glances into schedules, and daydreams into documents. If you were still awake by the time I reach the receipts for upholstery nails, and I promise there are more of them than anyone needs to know, feel free to subscribe or simply think kindly about doing so in a few days. No pressure. Versailles is patient. It has been practicing patience since 1682. The palace presented itself as freedom gilded, when in fact it was a golden timetable. A king's desire did not leap, it processed. The corridors were long on purpose, so that intention could slow into etiquette before it reached its destination. Doors opened in threes, with a pause between each as if thoughts were being folded and put away. The famous Hall of Mirrors was only half a story. Behind those mirrors were corridors thin as a sigh, with panels disguised as reflections leading not to scandal as pamphlets like to suggest, but to staircases where dust accumulated in very well-bred patterns. The building taught people to think in lines. Even temptation had to reserve a time slot through the antechamber called the Pile de Boeuf, where the air smelled faintly of wax, wool, and waiting. Life was measured in ceremonies with pleasant names that disguised their function as locks. The lever and the coucher, morning rise and evening retire, acted out like opera for an audience of badges and bows. A bed at Versailles was a stage, yes, but more importantly, it was a calendar. Who drew the curtain, who passed the shirt, who held the candlestick, each action came with a title, and every title had a predecessor and a successor. The result was a kind of polite paralysis that looked like power. Visitors admired the chandeliers and missed the quiet tyranny of minutes. When people sigh that Versailles was a prison, they forget to add that everyone there learned to rattle their chains softly, to a musical key preferred by the steward of ceremonies. The palace could not run on marble alone. It required maintenance of a very intimate sort, the silence of hinges, the humility of doormats, the discipline of candles cut exactly to a prescribed height so they would expire at the appointed line. Somewhere a man was paid to teach servants the correct angle at which to open shutters, so the sun would be impressive but not impolite. Another officer kept a book of keys shaped like a metallic family tree. Even the upholstery was governed. The king's chair could not sit naked. It wore a removable cover in public like a shy actor. If one looks closely at the inventories, one finds that vice at Versailles was a minor expense next to tassels. People imagined secret rooms as caverns of velvet and size. In fact, the small apartments behind the grand facades were domestic and slightly fussy. A private staircase might insist on a certain gate. A concealed door might be so proud of itself that it stuck in humid weather until a valet whispered to it with beeswax. The panels were hook marks like old earrings, clear evidence of pictures moved to alter a view by exactly 2 inches. The famous locks called espadrillettes clicked like polite applause. These places were designed less to inflame than to edit, trimming encounters down to manageable anecdotes. If a queen or a king wished to be alone, the palace allowed the wish in a very supervised way, as if solitude needed an usher. Around this architecture of restraint, the Sun King built a court devoted to the discipline of wanting. Louis XIV patient to the point of cruelty with his own. Image surrounded himself with rules that turned desire into choreography. His public devotions did not prevent private arrangements any more than a hat prevents weather. They only provided a ritual umbrella. He had favorites, as people do, though at Versailles the word favorite sat in memoranda with the coolness of a budget line. There were apartments assigned, jewels listed, carriages supplied, and, in gentle contradiction to the romantic pamphlets, vaccinations scheduled when physicians recommended them. A life near a king resembled employment more than adventure. Hours were posted. Visits were recorded on small cards in hands so elegant they resembled spun sugar. Spies adored this predictability. There was nothing to overhear more delectable than repetition. A valet who knew which slippers were preferred at which hour could predict moods better than a minister could. The mistress whom pamphleteers named with fireworks was often a woman of files and weather reports. What day to travel? Whether the roads to Marley would accept wheels, which cousin required a letter copied out in a hand that looked convincingly bored. She learned that the king liked his soup not hot, not cold, but loyal. She learned how to vanish into the etiquette so that her presence felt like a footnote the printers had forgotten to suppress. Court love, so-called, consisted mostly of schedules kneeling to schedules until even affection learned to curtsy. A court where one man's appetite shapes every corridor must pretend that it is not doing so. Under Louis XIV, the pretense became an art so perfect that it now looks like character. The king's preferences hummed through the palace like a metronome. Dinners expanded or shrank. Composers inserted new minuets. Ballets altered their pace as if a cardiologist had been consulted. Even the game of billiards felt the draft. When the king looked favorably on someone, the amber at the door of their apartment warmed. When he turned away, the servants there found themselves moving furniture with the particular caution of people who will need to sell it soon. Desire was a kind of weather that carried umbrellas of silk, and the palace learned to forecast. By the time Louis XV inherited this theater, the audience was tired and the props had begun to squeak. He was softer where his predecessor had been architectural. If the Sun King conducted, Louis XV listened. He preferred conversations that sat down. Versailles adjusted. Gossip lowered its voice and grew more tender, and then, because tenderness is expensive, more costly, somewhere off the main stage, a discreet house in the town became a logistical solution with a charming name. The Parcos Erfs the Stag Park. Although there was neither stag nor park, was in administrative terms a lodging managed by intermediaries with rents, paid wardrobes, inventoried, and anonymity, preserved under an assortment of assumed surnames that sounded like the more adventurous branches of a respectable family. The ages and circumstances of its residents are debated in sources with varying reliability. This is not a place for luridness. It is a place for ledgers. The ledgers speak frankly while saying very little. They list laundresses, tutors, footmen. A doctor called more often for fevers than for romance, and the name of a trusted woman who kept the keys. The arrangement was less a bacchanal than a filing system. Money moved, silence was maintained, and the king attempted to isolate a private life from a palace that turned every yawn into news. If you are picturing fireworks, set them to the dimmest setting and place them behind a curtain. What happened there influenced policy only insofar as time is finite. Hours spent in one house are not spent with ministers in another. That is the political story, and it is less scandalous than arithmetic. Of course, arithmetic can topple palaces. Louis XV's caution, his privacy, his habit of shrinking from attention except when protocol hauled him into it, all this produced a king who gave little spectacle to love him for and much blankness for pamphleteers to sketch monsters upon. Rumor found him like water finds a crack. The more he hid, the more visible the hiding became. The discreet house acquired mythological dimensions in print and in conversation, even as the roof simply needed repairs like any roof. It is difficult to rule a culture that cherishes spectacle by providing secrecy, just as it is difficult to govern a barbecue by serving only salads. The king meant to be moderate and ended up looking incomplete. Politically, moderation proved loud. Ministers came and went with the weary rhythm of chairs being scraped back and tucked in. There were attempts at reforms so sensible they offended everyone. New taxes people disliked because they were new. Old privileges people disliked because they were old. Meanwhile, the court rearranged itself like furniture that has decided to try being a library. The star of one decade became the cautionary tale of the next. Pamphlets called libels fluttered through Paris with a malice so industrious it deserved a pension. The police read them frowning. The public read them smiling. In Versailles, doors that once had learned to be quiet now learned to listen. Objects at court remember better than people. By the late 1770s, chairs that had supported royal elbows supported ministers' headaches. Tapestries woven with allegories of harmony acquired creases at the corners from being rolled for transport to lesser residences, an allegory of its own. Servants who had mastered the art of the king's glance now mastered the art of packing. When Louis XVI, conscientious and earnest, inherited the stage, he found props worn by too many performances. He brought sincerity, which is noble, to a theater that required spectacle, which is not. Behind him, the stories of earlier Bourbons of desire, positioned as policy or as escape, drifted like perfume, noticeable and unnecessary at the same time. None of this is the solitary cause of anything large. It is tempting to say that the appetites of kings led to the revolution, but that flatters gossip and ignores grain, bread, debt, war, ideas. These are load-bearing words. And yet the palace of Versailles became a symbol because it had trained itself so carefully to be read. Marble could be interpreted, fountains could be quoted. A rumor needed only to point in the general direction of a gilded gate, and the public imagination did the rest, like a crowd finishing a familiar chorus. Excess, whether modest or grand, wears a louder costume when it stands under crystal. The palace, which wanted to be a set of instructions, turned into an emblem you could understand at a glance. Symbols work on small scales too. An ordinary Persian who had never seen the king's bedchamber could look at a brocade in a shop window and feel he understood entirely why flour cost more that week. A woman buying thread might advise the shopkeeper to keep less gold trim because we are in a new age now, as if the calendar had resigned. Children played at court with furniture made of boxes and pretended to be courtiers, asking for nothing in particular. Even the mirror in a cafe, streaked with the fingers of many opinions, learned to flirt with the idea that its reflection was political. Versailles had exported a language. People spoke it fluently by pointing. The funny thing about moral lessons is how quickly they wear upholstery. After the revolution, many items from Versailles left the building through the polite door of auction. Chairs acquired entirely new lives, sitting in rooms that smelled of soup instead of cloves. A clock that once measured the king's morning now measured a shop's lunchtime. The objects obeyed. They were always good at obedience. In museums today, you can read labels that speak firmly about patronage and power while the thing itself say, a silver chocolate pot remains lost in its own thoughts, replaying the agreeable sound of a lid that fits. What remains from the Bourbon king's age of appetite, beyond anecdotes and furniture, is a sense of how institutions choreograph private lives. Versailles showed that a building can set the temperature of conversation, that a corridor can lengthen a rumor or tire it out, that a mirror can make a face important by surrounding it with importance. It also showed that desire, whether for people or for order, makes paperwork. The more a court wished to feel spontaneous, the more scribes labored in the background to prepare spontaneity in advance, like fireworks practiced at noon for an evening no one would remember accurately. You can still walk the hall of mirrors and imagine the thinner corridor behind it, the one no guidebook is really about, and understand the Bourbon story in the quiet click of an old lock. Power and longing share a superstition about doors. Both believe the right one will make everything easier. What the Bourbons discovered, slowly and with many receipts, is that every door needs oil, every hinge makes a note in the archive, and every shortcut takes the long way round eventually. If you listen, even the chandeliers admit this in a crystalline murmur. So the Palace of Lust was mainly a palace of lists, and the scandals of kings were mostly the management of minutes. The wild nights, when translated into the dialect of administration, read like schedules for a very private office. The legacy is not morality carved in stone. It is etiquette written in pencil, erasable but still visible when the paper is held to the light. If you are drifting now, that is appropriate. We have been shuffling through anterooms for quite some time. Versailles encourages amble. It gives you a corridor and another, and a panel that pretends to be a mirror and is indeed a door, but a door to yet another corridor, which is very French and very human. Somewhere a footman of 1750 sets, down a tray with the soft competence of someone who knows the route by heart. Somewhere a clerk corrects the spelling of a name that no one will remember, adds an accent, and feels he has improved Europe. Outside, the fountains perform a trick that requires enough pipe to wrap the globe twice, yet looks like water simply being pleased. Inside, curtains breathe with the window's draft. All of it adds up to a history that resists the fireworks people expect and instead offers a long, comfortable yawn. If you are still lightly awake, rest your thoughts on this. The grandeur was real, and so was the paperwork. The passion was sometimes legendary, often logistical, and the revolution came for reasons more complicated than furniture, but easier to picture with chandeliers in the frame. That is the power of a stage. Even when empty, it seems to be rehearsing. The lights dim. The mirrors hold their breath. Behind them, a corridor still waits to be walked quietly, and a small latch still remembers the weight of a careful hand. You might not expect the width of a silk ribbon to rearrange a kingdom, but at Versailles it frequently did, inch by careful inch, until a particular bow on a particular sleeve meant that someone would stand 3 steps closer to a door here, 3 words earlier, and nod as if empire were a polite rumor. If you re still awake when we get to the official rules for how long a candle may be before it is considered impertinent, feel free to subscribe or merely think the word subscribe very softly to yourself. No need to move. Versailles preferred that people did not, unless a bell rang. Then everyone moved in beautiful, useless lines like a clock showing off to other clocks. The palace liked its own performance so much that it taught walls to participate. A corridor didn't simply connect 2 rooms. It domesticated impulse by making it walk. The floors were waxed with recipes that read like pastries beeswax, turpentine, a whisper of rosin so that footsteps learned to be careful in case history, like wax, took a mark. The Hall of Mirrors doubled people not because it adored them, but because it needed witnesses. Behind those mirrors were service passages narrow as gossip, with panels cut to let trays pass through the gilded world like contraband common sense. Locks called espadnolettes clicked closed with the sound of etiquette being pleased with itself. The king's bed sat under a canopy that behaved like a timetable. Even intimacy had a waiting room. Now none in the palace pretended to be private, which is how you got those little hidden apartments that were less sinful than distracted. A secret door opened not onto velvet and harp music, but onto a tidy staircase that smelled faintly of tallow and cabbage. Because kitchens were nearer to truth than rumors were, the hinges carried a memory of every careful night. A valet kept a dish of beeswax in case a door decided to announce something at the worst possible moment. There were bell pulls disguised as tassels, and screens that looked like scenery. If someone says secret chamber, what you should imagine is a writing desk with 12 drawers labeled in a hand. So neat it could have sat for a portrait, and perhaps a pair of slippers arranged so the toes did not quarrel. Versailles was, above all, a golden prison of wanting. It invited desire to arrive on schedule and leave through the antechamber. The lover saw the king wake as if sunrise had been rehearsed. The couturier watched him retire while an audience admired the invention of curtains. Each person had a role, carefully named. Someone was responsible for the royal shirt, someone else for the order in which the buttons would be considered. The palace taught appetite to speak politely and to ask for another chair before sitting down. If the air itself could have applied for a post, it would have been appointed scent of the morning corridor, paid in lavender and discretion. Within this choreography, Louis XIV engineered his shadow. He had the kind of patience that turns a hallway into policy. The king's preferences traveled through Versailles like a weather report: more lace today, less lace tomorrow, a small thunderstorm of minuets at 5. His official relationships were battles staged as ballets. His private ones, as the pamphleteers liked to say while sharpening their adjectives, were numerous. Yet even the word lover was bureaucratic here, translated into apartments, stipends, and carriages that arrived when the fountain program allowed. The women we remember had ledgers to balance and letters to draft in careful code, where health meant patience and walks in the gardens meant a conversation carried without stumbling. It is fashionable to imagine the Sun King burning through hearts like candles, but the receipts suggest he burned mostly through wax. Gifts were itemized with the serenity of arithmetic, diamonds listed as if they were turnips, lace counted in L's, furniture described with a tenderness usually reserved for people. The king's attention rewarded families, rearranged corridors, and moved a rival 3 doorways farther from good news. A whisper at mass might become a chateau in the country by supper. The shadow he cast was administrative. Even scandal felt embossed, stamped with the correct seal, tied with ribbon the exact width set by regulation. An indiscretion at Versailles learned to curtsy before it misbehaved. All this order made secrecy look romantic, which is how the small apartments behind the mirrors acquired reputations far grander than their square footage. A stair hidden behind paneling could produce a rendezvous, but it more reliably produced errands. Notes passed like polite contraband. A portrait would be moved 2 inches to disguise a keyhole that almost no one used, except on Wednesdays when the cabinet maker came. The palace sold the idea of mystery while delivering mostly maintenance, like a theater advertising Shakespeare, and providing the finest ushers in Europe. Still, even careful buildings suffer from human optimism. A meeting would happen, someone would smile, and gossip would find its shoes. When the crown passed to Louis XV, the tempo changed from trumpet to flute. He liked quiet. He also liked privacy in a place designed as a megaphone. Court life tried to oblige by inventing new kinds of discretion. Thus appeared, by degrees and intermediaries, the famous solution in the town, a house whose name sounded like a park and whose records, when they exist at all, read like a polite essay in logistics. The Parcos Earths was not a myth, though many tales about it are. What can be said sleepily and safely is that intermediaries arranged lodgings, that money, chaperonage, and clothing were provided, that ages and circumstances are argued about by historians, and that the whole apparatus looked less like a poem than a filing cabinet with curtains. Ledgers from the era, when they turn up like absent-minded pigeons, contain the unromantic details that real life prefers. There are payments to laundresses, sums for tutors, receipts for candles, doctors' fees for sore throats, and the comfortable handwriting of a housekeeper who knew where to find more soap. The king's desire, which pamphlets inflated into opera, had to obey shopping hours. A carriage waits the way anyone waits when a wheel needs grease. A seamstress delivers a gown and is asked if the sleeves might whisper more and speak less. Courtiers speculate with remarkable confidence about events to which they were not invited, while the people actually involved worry about whether the chimney smokes when the wind sulks from the north. None of this is to deny harm. Secrecy tends to step on toes, even when it tiptoes. People left a little richer and sometimes a little bruised by the machinery of discretion. If you search for fireworks, you will find them in the pamphlets, not in the correspondence. The Parcos Earths worked like a dam, meant to hold back the palace's oceanic curiosity, and like many dams it leaked. Rumor, that busy river, found the gaps. Names were guessed. Numbers were inflated the way a bakery inflates its window with layers of cream. The moralists stared at Versailles through a lorgnette and saw what they wished to see. The police stared at pamphleteers and saw printers who needed very long holidays. The political weakness did not come from romance so much as from arithmetic again. Hours spent in one house were hours not spent with ministers who desired explanation, with parliaments that required soothing, with finances that prefer to be balanced. Louis XV, cherry of public theater, gave his enemies an empty stage on which they wrote his character. A cautious man acquires, in gossip, the outline of a libertine precisely because caution leaves blank space. Reforms arrived late, left early, or wore disguises that fooled no one. Meanwhile, the price of bread did what bread always does under pressure. It reminded everyone that physiology can defeat aesthetics before noon. Symbols, however, do not require balance sheets. Versailles had spent a century teaching Europe to read architecture as autobiography. By the 1770s, a brocade on a chair became a sermon. A chandelier became a pamphlet. The palace stood for excess even when the napkins were plain. The Bourbon story desire arranged as etiquette, appetite managed by furniture compressed beautifully into the word Versailles, which made argument easy. A citizen could point at a mirror and mean taxes, at a fountain and mean debt, at gossip and mean government. When Louis XVI, earnest and industrious, inherited this museum of metaphors, he brought sincerity to a room that insisted on spectacle. Sincerity is a fine thing at breakfast, it fails at parades. By then, the palace itself had grown tired. Chairs that had supported royal elbows now supported committees. Tapestries were rolled, creased, sold, repurposed. A clock that once told the lever found a second life timing a shopkeeper's lunches. Objects are loyal to whoever dusts them. The grand bed still looked like a small temple, but the mattress sighed with the particular sarcasm of fabric pulled too many times. In Paris, cafes collected conversations the way sleeves collect crumbs. People continued to play the old game of pretending knowledge. They knew which staircase Louis XIV had preferred on stormy days, an error, but a satisfying one. They knew the number of candles used in a week, usually wrong, always confident. Knowledge was an accessory, worn with the defiance of a hat tilted too far left. Revolutionary language practiced itself by describing furniture. To call for equality is large. To object to gilding is manageable. "We are in a new age," someone said in a haberdasher's shop, while discarding a bolt of gold braid in favor of cloth that looked like a sermon. The court, meanwhile, tried to remember how to breathe while the country asked for bread. Some gestures were heroic, some clumsy, most both. Versailles, expert at turning movement into symbolism, accidentally turned hesitations into myths. A door that stuck in damp weather became, in political metaphor, an ancient privilege refusing to yield. A key mislaid for a week became a situation. People are fond of stories in which objects take sides. It is the laziest magic, and therefore the most popular. What remains of the Bourbon king's celebrated appetites, once the anecdotes relax, is a lesson in how buildings choreograph people. Versailles was designed to teach every desire to behave like a minuet. It succeeded, which is to say that it covered restlessness in silk until restlessness learned to curtsy and then to complain. Louis XIV converted affection into architecture, and the architecture kept speaking long after his voice dimmed. Louis XV tried to keep a private life the way one tries to keep a goldfish secret on a mantelpiece. Everyone saw the bowl. They guessed at the fish. The bowl became the story. If you are drifting now, let the palace help. Imagine the morning light in the hall of mirrors doing its slow arithmetic on 100 panes. Imagine the secret passage behind them where a servant carries chocolate, careful not to let the cup clink against the saucer because porcelain, like politics, has opinions about sound. Imagine a book of keys, heavy as advice, being opened by a man who knows exactly which lock will sulk on humid days. Imagine a screen that smells faintly of paste, put in place to hide a draft that no one can admit exists. History is mostly this, management with excellent upholstery. When the palace emptied, it did not forget its lines. Tourists learn them now. The guides offer stories considerate of family audiences. They tell you where the king stood and where the queen stood. and sometimes they point at a mirror as if it were a witness in an old trial. The chandeliers agree to be historical evidence. They also, when no one's looking, enjoy being shiny. Meanwhile, scholars go on arguing about numbers and names as scholars should, counting the candles and the carriages again and again until the repetition itself becomes a lullaby. Somewhere in an archive, a clerk from 1758 still has a smudge of wax on his finger. He is adding the line, 6 small tapers for the closet, too large for the calm of the corridor. If you are still faintly awake by the time we reach the last receipt, consider how gently the palace turned desire into paperwork. Consider how an empire taught itself to stand in line for affection. Consider and then stop, because sleep prefers corridors to conclusions. The mirrors are dimming. The locks are pleased with their own quiet. A door somewhere closes with the contented click of a hinge that has been oiled just enough. And all the stories about kings and wanting fold back into the furniture, waiting for morning, when the candles can be measured again, just to be sure. You might not expect a locksmith's invoice to change the bedtime of a kingdom, but at Versailles, even the price of a key could rearrange an evening. The palace was a kind of gold-plated calendar, coaching time to stand up straight. Dawn was, not sunrise. It was the hour when wax had cooled enough to be polished without streaks. Night was not darkness. It was when the candle snuffers practiced their soft choreography, one quiet hiss at a time. If you're still awake when I get to the official width of a permissible ribbon, feel free to subscribe, or just think the word. Subscribe very gently to yourself, no need to move. Versailles preferred that people did not, unless summoned by a bell shaped like good manners. The Palace of Lust began, inconveniently, with corridors. They were so long that conversation stretched, itself as if to keep warm. Floors were waxed with a recipe that could pass for custard beeswax. Turpentine, a conservative idea of sunshine, so footsteps learned to tiptoe in case history remembered their weight. The Hall of Mirrors did not merely double people, it doubled caution. Behind those mirrors hid service passages that smelled faintly of boiled linen and fresh ink, where valets trotted like thoughts trying to keep up. Doors pretended to be walls. Walls pretended they had nothing to hear. Everyone practiced the art of being present without admitting it, a skill known elsewhere as discretion and at Versailles as breathing. Desire wore architecture like a costume. The king's bed was a stage with curtains trained to move like a rumor opening. The lever, the public rising, performed waking as if waking were a treaty. The couture rehearsed sleep, which for monarchs arrived by appointment. Between those two ceremonies, the building taught appetite to wait in line. Pages with the blue ribbon, then pages with the green ribbon. Then people who had miscalculated a cousin's importance and therefore stood near the window pretending to love draughts. Tea services clinked in a language of porcelain. The chocolate was thick enough to believe in, and the spoons knew which lips counted as politics. This is the golden prison part, though gold behaves very politely and disguises its bars as decoration. At Versailles, lust did not sprint. It filled in forms. A glance that mattered required. A chair at a specific angle. An assignation began with a calendar and ended with a receipt. The famous secret chambers behind the Hall of Mirrors were a less library of pleasures than hallway of intentions. Panels opened onto stairwells narrow, enough to make a conspiracy feel like a laundry errand. A careful valet kept a tin of beeswax to persuade hinges to keep secrets. Even the scandalous furniture had a filing system, drawers within drawers, as if intimacy were best preserved in increasingly smaller boxes, pamphleteers later described. Louis XIV as a comet in love with his own tale, but the papers of the day are more arithmetic than astronomy. His relationships read like account books that had learned to blush. There are entries for diamonds measured like vegetables, for apartments reassigned with the precision of chess. for coaches ordered in duplicate because the first coach had opinions about mud. Mistresses official, semi-official, and elevated from the fascinating category called rumor were less a parade than a ledger with bookmarks. Behind every name waited a separate world of tutors, pensions, and stewardly. Headaches because eviction at Versailles quickly acquired staff. The Sun King's shadow fell mostly on doorways. To be admitted was to be altered. A favorite's corridor became a climate, a staircase became an idea. Gossip, which elsewhere is a hobby, here was a navigational aid. The king's presence warmed certain rooms and cooled others. Upholsterers understood weather better than the astronomers did. Meanwhile, desire was domesticated by etiquette. Fans snapped open like legal opinions. Glove sizes became a soft currency. An embrace might be remembered by a footman as a delay in the carriage. Schedule, that famous palace of longing, largely preferred paperwork, and the paperwork preferred legibility. And so the great romances of the regime often resemble the tidy inventories of beautiful storage. Still, even an institution designed to make wanting respectable could not prevent the occasional enthusiastic footnote. Behind the mirrors, there were meetings that later historians cataloged the way botanists catalog moss carefully, with Latin where dates are uncertain. The doors were not as guilty as the stories make them. They opened mostly for tray service and drafts. A certain portrait hung 2 inches left to cover a latch, which sounds theatrical until you learn the latch liked to chatter in damp weather. And the portrait's true role was meteorological. Versailles sold mystery as an amenity. What it delivered most days was maintenance. The palace kept its secrets by boring them until they slept. When the crown passed to Louis XV, the overture softened from trumpet to flute. He preferred privacy in a building designed to multiply witnesses. Thus, the discreet architecture of discretion expanded into the town itself. Someone rented a house. Someone else paid for curtains that promised not to gossip. Later generations called this arrangement the Pargos Earths, sometimes with arithmetic that can't count and adjectives that had too much coffee. What we can say sleepily is that intermediaries existed, that ledger books exist for laundry and lessons, and that the king's desire was administered by people who knew the price of soap better than the price of scandal. The paperwork speaks, in its flat voice. A laundress is paid for 7 chemises too many, which tells you more about rain than romance. A physician visits to prescribe rest for a throat gone hoarse from singing, which is to say someone sang in a house where neighbors also sang and no one complained because rent was current. Tutors appear, disappear, reappear as if education were a polite tide. A seamstress delivers a gown and is asked if the sleeves might whisper more and talk less. These are not operas, they are errands. Meanwhile, pamphleteers perform cartwheels with words like harem, which is dramatic, and republic, which is also dramatic, and printers enjoy brisk sales of thin paper that burns faster than it persuades. The king's politics suffered less from appetite than from absence. Hours spent in small houses were hours not spent in large councils. Ministers waited, which ministers resent almost as much as they resent being supervised. The parliaments learned to raise their eyebrows into weapons. When reform needed theater, the stagehand-in-chief had gone for a walk. Thus the narrative of weakness attached itself to desire, not because desire commanded policy, but because it provided a scenery designers could paint without reading the budget. Rumor worked like water, finding cracks, indenting waterfalls where the floor merely creaked. On certain afternoons, even the weather sighed in pamphlet. By the time whispers hardened into themes, Versailles had become a museum of metaphor. The building meant too many things to survive unshaken. A chandelier could testify against attacks. A mirrored pane could reflect bread prices without ever seeing. A bakery The legacy of desire was not a single scandal, but a shorthand. Say Versailles, and your listener would unpack excess, etiquette, elaborate silence, and a suspicion that the chairs knew more than any minister. Louis XVI inherited a theater that distrusted sincerity and an audience that wanted arithmetic. He brought industry and good intentions, which are virtues, but they make poor chorus girls dot as for the legacy of the king's passions. It marched toward revolution at the tidy pace of logistics. Furniture was inventoried with the devotion once reserved for saints. Tapestries retired to storerooms, then to auctions, then to parlors that believed themselves improved by provenance. Clocks that had told the lever were located to counting houses, where they learned the steady heartbeat of interest. Objects are loyal to whoever dusts them. The bed of state remained an excellent bed, even when the state forgot its lines. Outside the palace, cafes rehearsed new manners while unpicking old. Laces. People requested clarity, which governments are slow to pour dot Versailles, nonetheless remained itself, a place where desire had been trained to move in eighth notes. Its final gift to the century was a lesson in choreography. Wanting can be elegant. It can also be expensive, especially when you pay for curtains that promise to keep quiet. The Sun King had turned affection into architecture, and the architecture kept talking long after the man stopped. Louis XV attempted privacy the way one attempts to keep a pet goldfish secret on a mantelpiece. Everyone saw the bowl. They argued about the number of fish. The argument outlived the bowl and became a national pastime, like counting candles and pamphlets or weighing liberty by the yard. If you're still with me, and if not, the upholstery. We'll remember for you, consider the palace very late at night. A servant carries chocolate along a corridor that registers footfalls like careful punctuation. A clerk in a small office adds a neat line to a ledger, 24 tapers for the antechamber, 4 for the music room, 1 extra because last week a Gus argued with the latch. A seam ripper rests in a porcelain tray, having removed a scandal. From a sleeve, a notebook sits open to a page where someone has drawn a plan of a hidden stairway and then crossed it out because the carpenter says it. Squeaks on humid days. Think of the secret apartments, which were less secret than scheduled. A door disguised as paneling opens onto a measured stair with 14 steps, each one the exact height of an apology. The room smells of lavender and paper. A small clock announces that it is later than gossip believes. A pair of slippers points toward a chair in the way of slippers that enjoy being helpful. Here, desire, so theatrical in memory, becomes the small business of conversation. People exchange sentences, not symphonies. They looked for the right word and sometimes found it. They made promises sized to fit a calendar. Outside, the fountains kept time while pretending not to dot. In the morning, the palace returns to its favorite game, which is to shape behavior by offering furniture. A chair indicates agreement. A footstool indicates favor. A missing footstool indicates that someone miscounted, which at Versailles could pass for politics. The king stands where the floor has learned to expect a king. Courtiers perform being casual by measuring the distance between their hats and the nearest decision. The Hall of Mirrors admires itself quietly, pleased to have survived another night without gossip cracking the glass. Later, much later, visitors arrive with guidebooks that translate etiquette into plots. They are shown a bed that looks like ambition asleep, a staircase that once confused a duchess, a keyhole that believes in legends. The guide explains with practiced gentleness that many of the spicier stories are only lightly salted truth. The chandeliers continue being correct and luminous. Somewhere a child counts how many mirrors can see the same mirror. A conservator dusts a gilded frame with a brush so soft it could pass for a breeze. The palace still knows how to make time behave dot, and if your eyes are heavy now, let them be. Think of a ribbon lying on a dressing table, measured against a ruler. That has no opinion and therefore makes an excellent judge. Think of a candle trimmed to regulation length, obedient to a rule that nobody remembers writing. Think of a lock deciding, very quietly, whether to click. Somewhere in the shadows behind the mirrors, a small latch rests and does not squeak. Desire turns back into furniture. Paperwork closes its eyes. The corridor goes on exactly as far as you need it to, and then a little farther, in case sleep takes the scenic route. You might not expect the angle of a chair to decide the trajectory of a romance, but at Versailles, a few degrees of upholstery could tilt history like a saucer under a teacup. The palace was a clock that told time and ceremonies. The hours were padded with velvet and sounded like slippers. Morning did not truly begin until the royal curtains parted with their theatrical shiver, and night was only admitted once the last candle surrendered in a small sigh of smoke. If you're still awake when we reach the official rules about who stood how close to which bedchamber door, feel free to subscribe or simply blink a little longer than usual and call it support. Versailles appreciated gestures that could be measured with a ruler. The building performed desire as if it were a polite dance learned from a patient tutor. Corridors stretched on, teaching footsteps to think about their choices. The hall of mirrors multiplied glances far beyond their intentions, so even quiet looks learned to wear formal clothes. Behind those mirrors, slim passages wound, like careful thoughts where valets slid by with hot chocolate that traveled under lids as if it were a secret. Door panels pretended to be innocent walls. Walls pretended they did not carry stories, and stories adjusted their hems so they wouldn't snag on a hinge. Even the floors practiced discretion, being waxed to that special sheen which encouraged people to glide rather than stomp. Like gossip walking on tiptoe. Versailles is often called a golden cage, which flatters the cage and understates the schedule. Desire was admitted by ticket, and the ticket was etiquette. A glance that might have been spontaneous in an ordinary house became, in this palace, a tiny appointment between two calendars. The celebrated secret chambers that supposedly bloomed behind the hall of mirrors were mostly geometries of carpentry, good for redirecting drafts and encouraging maps. Yes, panels could open. Yes, little stairs could descend as decisively as a whisper. But most days the hinges carried trays of pastries and the stairs led to inventories. A tender conspiracy existed with the beeswax tins. One could coax silence out of a stubborn hinge, much like a musician coaxes a note from an obstinate violin. If Louis XIV was the sun, he shone according to a timetable printed in human beings. The lever his public rising turned waking into a kind of courtly weather report. The couture did the same for sleep, proving that even yawning with training can be ceremonial. Between these two bookends, desire behaved like a library book. Signed out, signed in, late fees paid, and diamonds or apartments with an extra fireplace. Mistresses appear in the records the way punctuation appears in a sentence, regularly, sometimes extravagantly, rarely without a comma of paperwork. The more official the affection, the thicker the paper. Love at Versailles needed clerks, and clerks, like ivy, multiply on warm stone. Pamphleteers later wrote as if the Sun King's heart were a marketplace, peopled by dramatic vendors. But the archives insist on receipts. A favorite might receive a very specific number of wax candles per month, which is not romantic unless you admire good lighting. Apartments were reassigned with chest-like caution, each move considering drafts, proximity to hot chocolate, and the delicate politics of staircases. A gift of lace implied a certain geography of gratitude. Fans open like legal documents. There was tenderness, no doubt, but it learned to queue. If something scandalous did occur in a small room behind a large mirror, it was entered in the Budget as upholstery wear and tear, and treated with the professional calm we reserve for sofa legs. The palace taught the court to communicate with objects. A chair became a signal. A footstool transformed into a thesis about rank. The exact width of a ribbon could announce allegiance more persuasively than a poem. Porcelain whispered about favor with every careful rattle, and the chocolate, thick as certainty, replaced many arguments with a courteous silence. To live at Versailles was to absorb an education in angles, legs of tables, lines of sight, degrees of permission. Desire, domesticated in brocade, discovered that nothing is so intense as a touch that must wait through 3 polite paragraphs before it is allowed to occur. The Sun King's list of companions, long and frequently catalogued, functioned as a weather map for the entire court. When Madame this cooled, anteroom B became drafty. When Mademoiselle that warmed, staircase D discovered it had always been a boulevard. The monarch's gaze did not just select a person, it choreographed rooms. Flowers migrated, musicians appeared as if from a drawer, and the resentments of lesser nobility arranged themselves into careful bouquets. The world has remembered the passion and forgotten the logistics. But without the men who shoveled coal, the women who laundered 6 identical chemises, the clerks who tracked candles and carrots with equal sincerity, there would be very little history to call sumptuous dot by the time the crown settled on Louis. 15, privacy had become a kind of unproven hypothesis. The palace, designed to multiply witnesses, obliged him to outsource discretion. Thus the small, respectable houses, the borrowed doors, the curtains that learned to keep their opinions to themselves. Posterity labeled the situation with big words, the Parcos earths then filled in the details, with a confidence seldom found in the cleaning bills. What we can say, gently, is that intermediaries existed, that soap and schooling were reliably funded, that laundresses filled ledgers with practical entries about rain and stains, and that a king's complicated affections were administered by people who knew the price of muslin better than the price of metaphors. The paper trail hums a soft tune. A tutor is paid for arithmetic and posture, a combination which summarizes the century better than any anthem. A seamstress returns because a sleeve needs to drape with less opinion. A doctor prescribes rest and broth to a voice tired from singing, and the recipe reads like a lullaby. These records contain no thunder, they prefer drizzle. Yet pamphlets blown in from Paris insisted on storms. Harem, scandal, ruin. Printers enjoyed the weather, of course. Ink sells better in a downpour. The difference between a ledger and a rumor is the difference between a floor plan and a dream. Both describe a room, but only one tells you where to find the chairs. Politics did not collapse because of lace, but lace was a convenient symbol for people impatient with budgets. The king's attention wandered. Ministers learned the tactful arts of waiting and pretending the wait was productive. Parliaments, those ancient courts that had discovered how to frown persuasively, frowned. Reform, a demanding child, disliked being postponed for a walk. Thus lust was recruited to explain every wobble, as if the kingdom were a carriage listing to one side because a cushion fluffed itself. The truth is duller and therefore likelier. Administration requires a kind of passion too, and it rarely found itself invited to small houses with quiet curtains. As stories accumulated, Versailles morphed from residence to symbol, which is a stressful promotion for any building. Every corner was asked to represent something, excess or elegance, hierarchy or harmony, too much or never enough. A chandelier could indict a tax policy by simply sparkling too conscientiously. Mirrors, which had spent decades minding their own reflections, woke to find themselves accused of repeating injustice 357 times. The palace, a patient collaborator, took the criticism politely. After all, furniture. is accustomed to people talking past it. The legacy of all this managed feeling, scheduled longing, and curated convenience curved toward decline exactly as slowly as a polished corridor curves toward another door. Inventories lengthened until they resembled novels with shy characters named Armchair Green Damask 2. Tapestries retired with dignity, then returned to public life as auction lots, which is the textile equivalent of a comeback tour. Clocks that had once told the lever learned the dependable music of the counting house. Even the bed of state discovered it was, at the end of its paragraphs, a bed, and slipped soundly in exile as if relieved to be reading fewer intentions. Meanwhile, the new century broke its fast in cafes where pamphlets were considered a balanced breakfast. People grew fond of the phrase public opinion, a polite way to describe crowds that prefer verbs. Versailles, basking and dismayed, watched language become a ladder that anyone might climb. Desire, which once whispered behind panels with beeswax tinges, drifted into the street and turned into slogans. An old refrain that private pleasure predicts public weakness proved irresistibly singable. It did not matter that the melody had been patched with guesses. Revolutions enjoy a lively tempo. Even so, the palace continued to be very good at evening. Picture it well after midnight, when the stone cools like a composed brow. A clerk in. A tidy room adds one last line to a page. 4 dozen tapers for the antechamber, 1 flask of oil for the lock that forgets itself in damp weather, a fresh brush for dusting gilding that prefers to be addressed gently. Somewhere a mouse studies. Protocol from beneath a carpet. It will chew only beneath chairs belonging to third cousins. A rope barrier dozes in another century. The mirrors, which have seen many types of breath, fog slightly in the memory of warm chocolate. Consider the supposedly secret rooms again, sleepy with their own reputation. Here a panel slides, and there the stairwell descends, not into scandal, but into the optimistic smell of carpenter's glue. A chair waits with the patience of furniture. A small clock acknowledges that it is later than rumor thinks. A folded fan holds the temperature of a hand that has already gone elsewhere. The room understands that the difference between privacy and secrecy is often just the thickness of a door. In palaces, thickness varies with fashion. Morning returns with its measured dignity. The day lays out its costumes like a theater dresser, and people step into their roles with the relieved competence of those who have rehearsed. A servant balances a tray in one hand and 3 levels of protocol in the other. The tray is lighter. The king stands where tradition tells him he will look most inevitable. Courtiers negotiate distances. 1 pace nearer equals 1 question fewer. No one hurries. Even ambition glides. The hall of mirrors checks its own posture. It is ready to multiply success and embarrassment without preference, like a conscientious accountant. Later, during those years when the old order walked on tiptoe, visitors wandered the rooms that had held so many carefully folded intentions. Guides developed the soft voice suitable for gilding. Here, they said, is the bed that performed sovereignty at appointed hours. Here is the hidden door, practical and scenic. Here is a key that learned what discretion weighs. The visitors nodded and photographed chandeliers with the reverence of people greeting distant relatives. In the gardens, fountains resumed their habit of pretending they are not expensive. The clipped hedges argued politely about geometry. If you need a place to rest your eyes, imagine a ribbon on a table, measured against a ruler that forgives, but does not forget. Imagine a candle trimmed to regulation length, obedient to a rule drafted by someone who appreciated uniform flames. Imagine a lock deciding, with unpublicized wisdom, when to click. The great appetites of kings have long since dissolved into upholstery and footnotes. What remains is the choreography they taught the rooms. Want nothing quickly, approach everything. At an angle, and always let a chair help. The palace hums on in its agreeable key, half lullaby, half inventory, careful not to wake any sleeping scandals. And somewhere in a passage behind the mirrors, a hinge, newly waxed, declines to squeak, which is the most Versailles way to tell a story goodnight. You might not expect the angle of a mirror to change the temperature of a rumor, but at Versailles it often did, like a window that thinks it is a stove. The palace did not run on passion so much as it ran on procedure. Desire wore shoes with soft solace. It learned to wait its turn on marble floors. If you're still awake when I get to the rules about which chair a duchess may borrow in which room, feel free to subscribe, or simply let your eyelids sign up on your behalf. Versailles prized gestures so small that a blink could qualify as paperwork. The building was designed to make every look public, and then it built small passages to pretend otherwise. Mornings opened with the king's waking, a performance with a cast, a script, and standing tickets that were, in fact, mostly about standing. The great bed was a stage. Curtains swished like well-trained waves. Everyone behaved as if the sun itself needed witnesses to rise. Yet behind the panels, carpenters had fitted short staircases and narrow doors that allowed servants, doctors, and sometimes a thought to move without applause. Beeswax tamed the hinges. Linen muffled the footfalls. Even secrets learned to speak. In a library voice, people called it a golden prison, which sounds severe until you notice how carefully the prison fed you hot chocolate. The prison had a schedule for fountains. It rationed water to the groves like a gardener with a metronome. It taught chairs to carry rank, the full armchair for a few, the little folding stool for others, and for many, the honor of standing as still as furniture. The palace curated distance the way museums curate light. A favored person might be allowed the thickness of one door fewer between themselves and the royal bedchamber. Permission could be measured with a measuring tape. Those famous secret chambers behind the Hall of Mirrors were not so much theaters of sin as they were capillaries of maintenance. They held brooms and bills as often as letters. The hall itself multiplied glances until even modest ones wore opera costumes. A sideways look became a parade, but most panels opened to a world of trays, mops, and the eternal diplomacy of the wax pot. A valet with a kettle controlled more desire than a poet with a sonnet. No one recites a poem in cold chocolate. Somewhere a locksmith rehearsed the etiquette of keys. He knew which key was allowed to jingle. The hall's numbers were sleepy but precise. 17 arches, 17 mirrors filling each arch. The chandeliers rehearsed their sparkle in the morning and performed it at night. Candles consumed their own biographies, tall in the afternoon, sensible at dinner, philosophical after midnight. There were so many candles that clerks counted them by the pound, a measurement that made light seem like flour. If a scandal did occur in a warm corner, it needed to schedule itself around sweeping, because dust was the only thing that moved with urgency. Versailles did not like urgency. It preferred polished dot. The Sun King moved through this order like a clock with hair. His mistresses are remembered as storms, yet the archives show ledgers. Louise was lodged here with so many curtains. Athenai received that apartment, those tapestries, and a carefully itemized thunder of lace. Madame de Maintenon, who wore gravity like a shawl, collected schools rather than jewels, and still had to file forms. Love required receipts. The gifts looked like affection, but read like budgets. Even jealousy learned the grammar of allocations. In a very French way, the heart spoke fluid stationery. A glance from the king planted new paths in the gardens. The hedges bent to accommodate a conversation. The fountains arranged their timing to flatter an arrival. Promotions trailed affection, the way shadows trail a torch. A captain became a colonel because a look lingered in the wrong room for the right length of time. Yet for all that, The mechanics were cautious. An apartment change could take weeks. Carpets did not sprint. Courtiers learned that the shortest distance between 2 points is never a corridor, but a rumor with sturdy shoes dot in this world, desire shaped the entire court by telling it how to stand. A duchess worried about chairs. A bishop worried about the number of steps between his sermon and his supper. The king worried about rain, which embarrassed fountains. Tailors worried about embroidered suns maintaining their optimism across multiple seasons. In the evenings, small suppers relieved the day of its stiffness. Music rehearsed the art of being beautiful without being memorable. The opera invented spectacles whose plots politely moved out of the way of the curtains. If someone sighed heavily, someone else wrote it down. Then the crown moved from one lily to the next, and the palace continued its habit of multiplying eyes. Louis XV preferred smaller rooms. He liked keys that opened inward, not outward. He drafted privacy from the odds and ends of floor plans. The petty's apartments became a school for discretion. A table set for 6 could seat the nation if you read the guest list as symbolism. Soup arrived precisely warm. Wine thought about being famous. Laughter learned to conclude on the 3rd note, not the 4th. After a while, the furniture knew. The queue better than the people. The Parcos Earths, so often described as Aurora looks, on paper, like administration. There are guardians, allowances, washing bills, doctor's signatures, and a school book or two. We should describe it with tact. It was a system of private arrangements overseen by public money. It placed dignity under management and pretended that management improved it. Pamphlets later painted the whole affair with a brush dipped in lightning. But clerks who owned only pencils were not so dramatic. Their words were small and tidy. They spelled scandal as monthly stipend and romance as linen delivered by the dozen. Even outrage had to sign for parcels dot at the same time. There were affections that left good traces. Madame de Pompadour filled rooms with industry, Sevres porcelain learning elegance, engravers finding their manners, architects coaching stone. Her influence was a salon with walls. She understood how to be necessary without being noisy. Later, Madame du Barry made fireworks of silk. All of it fed the pamphlet presses, which preferred sugar to subtleties. If one wonders how political weakness grows out of dinner, the answer is that dinner becomes a theater, and the parterre critics buy cheap seats. The king's attention, meanwhile, practiced evasive maneuvers. Ministers noticed. They brought papers. To meals, they learned how to summarize a war in the time it takes to pour sauce. The parliaments, those old courts with new nerves, developed a taste for public disagreement. Taxes learned to be shy. Roads, which had always needed repairs, learned to ask twice. The kingdom did not fail because of embroidery, but embroidery makes a photogenic culprit. It sits still for portraits. It sparkles on command. It is also easier to blame a lace cuff than a balance sheet. What survives in the memory is Versailles as a symbol of excess, a building that glows with so much intention that even its quiet corners look theatrical. The truth is, symbols are hard workers. They carry meanings up and downstairs all day. Long, Versailles carried more than its share. People looked at its ailerons and saw arrogance. They looked at its gates and saw distance. They looked at its gardens and saw geometry pretending to be nature. The palace accepted the assignment with courtly resignation. A building cannot argue. It can only echo. Over time, lamps moved from gilded rooms to pamphlet pages. Passions traveled in printed wrappers. The affair of the diamond necklace, though not truly a Bourbon love story, taught the public to read scandal the way some people read weather, as a forecast that proves anything. Marie Antoinette, who liked gardens small enough to know their flowers, became a portrait woven from other people's adjectives. Bakeries had more to say about politics than ballrooms, but ballrooms were easier to draw. The symbol worked overtime, while the price of bread developed an audience. When the revolution finally arrived, it did not bother to check the candle accounts. It borrowed Versailles as a mask and wore it through the streets. The king and queen learned a new geometry, the measured distance between palace and city. Mirrors faced other mirrors in other places. The old choreography chairs, stools, distances retired without ceremony. The palace discovered that it could be a museum of itself. Visitors came to admire a bed that behaved like an argument and a doorknob that remembered every hand. Guides learned the soft voice of custodians. Dust learned to be historic dot. If you need something quiet to hold in your mind, picture a box of keys. Each one is labeled in a hand so neat it seems shy. One opens a door behind the hall of mirrors. Another opens a staircase that does not want to be important. Another, slightly bent, opens a cupboard filled with ceremonial napkins. The locksmith who cut these shapes lived as calmly as metal permits. He knew that privacy is a drawing problem and that scandal is a lighting problem. He kept the filings in a jar, because filings like Company Bank also the candles that once kept count of evenings. Their stubs were saved, remelted, and returned to duty, like soldiers who prefer indoor service. The wicks remembered music. The wax remembered laughter, practicing its court manners. When a candle smoked, someone pinched it into grace. When it sputtered, someone trimmed it with a tool shaped like an apology. Light is a language of patience. Versailles spoke it with. Grammar dot it is tempting now to imagine the secret chambers as wild theaters. They were more often waiting rooms for coats. A panel slides. A narrow stair descends. You discover an alcove that smells faintly of starch. A footman, relieved to be off the main route, exhales like a man who has successfully navigated a diagram. Somewhere a note is passed that says only later, and that word is already tired. The truly dangerous items are the ledgers, because numbers are excellent storytellers when asked the right dull questions. All the while, the palace taught Europe how to watch itself. Even the birds in the gardens learned to land with ceremony. The swans held their necks like sentences who know their verbs. The gardeners clipped hedges into truths about symmetry. The fountains practiced timing, starting only when important. Feet were nearby, then resting to consider the cost of being impressive. Water understood both obedience and fatigue. When the wind lifted the spray, the king happened to shine a little more dot in the end. The legacy is less about fever than about furniture. Versailles standardized longing. It turned desire into a posture and perfected the art of placing a chair, so precisely that a conversation would behave. It reminded Europe that love can be threaded through a needle and hemmed to fit a calendar. It also proved that a palace can be both a home and a rumor, and that rumors, like court dances, prefer to repeat themselves until someone claps politely. If you are still listening, let the mirrors in your mind dim a little. Let the hall become a hallway again. Let the keys rest in their box, each one pleasantly heavy with former importance. Somewhere, a candle finishes its sentence, and another begins in the same careful voice, as if all history were simply an unhurried conversation about where to put the chairs. You might not expect a palace to keep a schedule for desire, the way a kitchen keeps a schedule for soup, but Versailles did, down to the minute and sometimes the teaspoon. The building learned early that feelings are louder than trumpets, unless we are asked to speak in a library voice, so it invented a library voice for everything. Doors practiced it. Footmen practiced it. Even the fountains rehearsed a polite little hush between spurts, like water clearing its throat. If you're still awake by the time we reach the royal policy on who may borrow, which chair and which room, and there was such a policy, feel free to subscribe, or simply let your eyelids do the paperwork on your behalf. Versailles admired paperwork. It considered paper a very slow kind of applause. Morning there began as theater. The king woke in stages, as if the sun itself needed a script. Curtains parted with a workmanlike flourish, and dozens of invited eyes observed the royal yawn, the way botanists observe a rare flower. The bed was not so much furniture as a polite hill. Meanwhile, the corridors, wide as ponds, filled with people who had mastered the art of walking as if gliding, their heels trained to make almost no decisions. The palace employed many talents, but none so useful as the person who knew which door to leave slightly ajar. Behind the painted panels were passageways as narrow and practical as shoelaces. Servants carried porcelain cups of thick chocolate along these shoelaces, with the solemnity usually reserved for creeds. The protocol for chocolate was longer than some marriages. Versailles is often described as a golden prison of desire. Although the bars were mostly ribbons, ribbons had rules. You could wear them, but they must not wear you, and they must not contradict the wallpaper, which had its own ambitions. The palace preferred everything arranged in elaborate stillness, like a landscape that has memorized its posture. A duchess could sit in a fauteuil with arms, a countess on a low stool without, a marquis on nothing at all if the room was crowded and the hierarchy wished to stretch its legs. Distances were meaningful. The right to stand a little closer to a doorway could be more intoxicating than perfume. Whole careers were built on the width of an aisle. Visitors loved the Hall of Mirrors, where whispers were turned into parades. Each mirror politely multiplied the smallest glance until rumor looked like choreography. But what people rarely remember are the service corridors curled behind that bright avenue. There the walls smelled of beeswax and linen, and in niches you found things without reputations, a broom with a good opinion of itself, a box of spare wicks labeled in very neat script, a small stool for the candlers to rest the moment between flames. The palace had secret chambers of pleasure, of course, but they were usually the pleasure of not being seen. A hidden stair promises everything and delivers a back door and a breath. Most of the time, that was quite enough. Candles were counted by the pound, which made light feel pleasantly edible. The chandeliers swallowed them like cautious stars, so many to a branch, so many branches to a ballroom, the arithmetic as sleepy as it was bright. When an evening ended, scrapers trimmed the stubs and dropped them into tin for remelting, like memories being sent back to the beginning to try again. The fire screens, embroidered with scenes of shepherds who never had meetings, were positioned to protect complex hair. A wig, properly powdered, could hold small weather systems. A good fire screen assured the climate remained moderate. These things mattered because the stage set the story, and Versailles valued stories that could be folded neatly and put away in a drawer. Louis XIV, the Sun King, understood that power prefers good lighting. He arranged his affections the way. He arranged his avenues, long, straight, and lined with places where people might sit and admire the view. His mistresses are usually described as tempests, but the archives show ledgers, an apartment reassigned here, a tapestry moved there, a pension agreed upon with the precision of a compass. Louise de la Valliere, soft as a secret. Athénée de Montespan, brilliant as a chandelier. Madame de Maintenon, earnest as a schoolroom each, received rooms calibrated like musical keys. Desire had a postal address. It came with rugs, these. Relationships shaped the court less by passion than by logistics. A favorite's door redirected traffic. Corridors came to heal. Household posts sprouted like tidy shrubs. A glance from the king could promote a captain, and a half hour at a window might water the roots of an entire family's future. Even jokes observed rank. A small one could be told in a salon. Larger ones required a garden. The etiquette of chairs, the time of supper, the right to a footman's shade on a hot day, These played in the king's orbit with the gravity of moons. The court learned to speak a dialect in which approval was measured in distance, and distance in carpets. Of course, scandal hovered like perfume that forgot when to leave. During the Fair of the Poisons, whispers crawled across tapestries with the determination of tiny soldiers. But even that was catalogued. Lists of names, lists of bottles, lists of questions written in a script careful enough to look innocent. The public version sounds torrid. The back office version looks like stationery. Versailles preferred its chaos pressed between pages. You cannot embroider drama, but people tried, and the results were exquisite. Meanwhile, the king kept building. Fountains and victories, both of which required the same two ingredients. Money and applause.desire shaped the daily life of the court most obviously through doors. Who could pass which door and when and wearing what mattered more than any anthem. A lady of the bedchamber with the correct key could accomplish more before breakfast than a minister without one by noon. The locksmiths of Versailles practiced a delicate kind of politics. They kept diagrams of the palace's private organs, if you will, their sketches like music that only a few could hear. A tiny change to a latch could move the universe of a rumor by several inches. When the crown moved to the head of Louis XV, the palace learned to speak more softly. He preferred smaller rooms and conversation at the size of a hand. Privacy, which had previously been a rumor in a wig, acquired pins and hinges. The petty's apartments multiplied like parentheses, allowing sentences that did not wish to be declaimed. Here, the king could be a person who liked keys and quiet. The furnishings practiced a domestic vocabulary, tables that understood, soup, chairs that thought kindly of knees. Music, stripped of spectacle, discovered the charm of being within arm's length. The parcos urfs later became a word that pamphlets loved to shout, though in the registers it looks inconveniently like administration. There are receipts for linen always, linen entries for the doctor, notes about a tutor hired to teach. Penmanship, dates for inoculation against smallpox, rent for a discreet house on an unambitious street. It was an arrangement, and arrangements are rarely romantic on paper. The moral historians prefer metaphors, but the clerks had only ink. They wrote with neatness and one suspects, the faint smell of starch. If scandal knocked, it was asked to wait in the vestibule while someone found a broom. Yet the king's tastes and the murmur around them chipped away at the grand marble confidence of the state. Ministers, learning that gravity does not always wear a crown, shortened their memoranda to the length of a dinner. They became experts at timing. A war could be summarized between the fish and the roast if the sauce cooperated. The parliaments, those old courts with new appetites, sensed an opening and raised their voices like schoolboys who discovered that whispering can be loud. Pamphleteers sketched the kingdom as if the pantry led directly to the parliament, and across the pages little cartoons escorted respectability to the door. Versailles went on being beautiful, which people increasingly mistook for not listening. The fall from majesty was not a crash, but more of a slow untying, as if the shoelaces of the state had learned to daydream. Money lost its enthusiasm, the harvest sulked. Roads remembered their potholes. Priests and philosophers argued about homework. Meanwhile, dinners continued to be served on plates that could see their own reflections, and the music kept its manners. It is a comfortable myth to say that lace ruined everything. Lace minds its own business. But once people suspect that lace is laughing at them, it acquires opinions it never asked for. By then Versailles had perfected its role as a symbol of excess so thoroughly that it no longer needed to be present to be blamed. Cities far away used the word Versailles the way people use a weather report, short, decisive, and wrong half the time. The palace became a stage on which the idea of luxury performed forever at the same volume. A doorframe could carry more scandal than a person. The hall of mirrors gleamed like a rumor distilled into furniture. You could almost hear the building sigh. Symbols do heavy lifting, and the palace carried meanings up and down staircases all day until it was out of breath. The diamond necklace affair, not truly a Bourbon love story, but far too shiny to ignore, taught the public that truth travels. Slower than jewelry. A clumsy fraud letters invented, a queen impersonated by moonlight, a necklace shuffled between hands with the competence of a farce, became an opera in pamphlets, complete with choruses. No one had the patience to read ledgers once a sparkle set the tempo. The queen, who preferred a garden small enough to know the names of the flowers, became in print a mask worn by other people's adjectives. The bakery did not care either way. It had its own economics. But loaves have very little press strategy. By the late 1780s, passions that had long been curated by etiquette began conducting themselves. Assemblies discovered they could remain seated and still be dramatic. Speeches grew legs. The court's old language of distance and chairs, that subtle dialect of upholstery, suddenly sounded like a foreign tongue. Versailles tried to reply with architecture, stairways, galleries, the reassuring logic of right angles, but architecture talked slowly. The city talked faster. Songs developed choruses everyone could remember. Keys changed. The palace, with its millions of reflections, watched while the future arranged itself without antechambers. When the revolution arrived, it brought a new kind of candlelight. Not the wax measured by the pound, but a flame measured by a crowd's attention. The king and queen learned the geometry between 2 points, palace and city, city and scaffold, rumor and decree. Rooms that had once organized whispers into melodies now echoed with emptiness. Furniture discovered it was a witness. Later, guides would call the bed a state monument, and the state would nod from a respectable distance. Versailles became a museum of its own rumors, which is to say, it learned to be quiet even about memory. And yet, if you walk there in your mind an easy stroll, since marble is a good imagination surface, you notice how much of the past is housekeeping. The hall is swept. The mirrors are tamed with linen until they forget to multiply. A candelabrum stands still, not because it is noble, but because it holds wax. A caretaker dusts the gilded acanthus leaves with a brush that respects foliage. In a drawer, carefully labeled, lies a cluster of old keys, each with a tag in modest handwriting. Small door by the antechamber, panel behind the third sconce, stair to the mezzanine. The locksmith who filed them had no idea he was shaping metaphors. He thought mostly about fit. Consider, too, the napkins. There were treatises on their folds, fans of the bishop's hat, fans of the artichoke, triangles proposing themselves as mountains. Throughout the century, hands constructed small landscapes out of cloth at every meal. No one declared a republic with a napkin, but a civilization's patience can be read in its linen. The same could be said of shoe buckles, which were small speeches about ankles, or of glove etiquette, which taught fingers to behave as if moral philosophy depended on them. These are the minor laws through which the major ones learn their manners. The legacy of the Bourbon king's passions, so often filed under thunder, rests oddly in these small arts. Desire taught the court to care about the angle at which a door closes and the distance at which a greeting becomes an embrace. It insisted that feeling be translated into furniture, schedule, and dress, until the translation stood on its own and spoke with borrowed authority. That habit survived the kings. It trickled into salons and newspapers, into the city's impatience, into the expectation that life should arrange itself attractively and on time. When that expectation met the cost of bread, it asked difficult questions in an elegant tone. If you need a picture to soften the edges of all this, Imagine the mirror polishers at dawn. They arrive before the echo wakes. Their claws are quiet as moth wings. They move down the hall step by unhurried step, removing yesterday's fingerprints, which are small, harmless confessions. Each streak surrendered is a rumor retired. When they finish, the glass looks like breath held. The room waits for footsteps that will behave like sentences, some declarative, some only pretending to be dot, and finally, think of the gardens, trimmed with patient scissors into ideas about order. The trees are shaped the way geometry would shape them if geometry wore leaves. The fountains rehearse their arcs and then, as a favor to history, pretend to be spontaneous. In that trimmed world, scandal cannot run, it can only stroll, which is why the palace always felt slower than its stories. Versailles' greatest trick was not abundance, or even spectacle, but tempo. It taught time to walk instead of hurry. It asked desire to cue politely and give its name to the usher. Even its secrets were punctual dot, so if you're still here, let your mind sit down in a very correct chair and let the upholstery be wiser than you. Imagine the last candle of the night leaning into its pool, saying something gentle to the wick. Imagine the keys waiting in their box, heavy with former importance and happy not to be needed. Down the corridor, a broom considers the floor and finds it sufficient. Outside, the alleys of lime trees keep their lines. The mirrors dim until they reflect only a little moon. Somewhere, the chocolate pot cools to a dignified silence. And the palace, relieved of its job for the evening, lets its terrible reputation hang on the peg with the coats and becomes, for a few drowsy hours, only a building that remembers where everyone used to stand.